Welcome, friends. Tonight, we set out on a journey unlike any other, a cross-country tour of the final resting places of 60 men and women who made the world laugh. From the golden age of vaudeville to the era of Saturday Night Live, from slapstick pioneers who risked their necks for a gag to sharp-tongued stand-ups who risked their careers for a truth, these are the comedians who shaped the way America thinks about funny. We will visit grand mausoleums in Los Angeles where matinee idols and television legends rest side by side. We will stop at humble country cemeteries in the heartland, at tiny churchyards in New England, and at memorial parks from coast to coast. We will even pause at the edge of San Francisco Bay, where the ashes of one of the greatest performers of our time were scattered on the water. Along the way, you will hear stories you remember, about shows you watched and records you played, and stories that may surprise you about the lives these performers lived when the cameras were off and the curtain was down. So settle in and join us. There is a lot of ground to cover. Our first stop is a sun-drenched corner of Southern California at a place that has served as the final destination for Hollywood royalty since 1906. We begin at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, 300 acres of manicured hillsides overlooking the Los Angeles basin. More legends of entertainment are buried here than in any other cemetery on Earth, and we will be returning to these grounds more than once today. But first, let us make our way into the Freedom Mausoleum, up to the Faith of Our Fathers Terrace, and into a corridor known as the Sanctuary of Heritage. Here, side by side for eternity, rest George Burns and his beloved wife, Gracie Allen. George Burns lived to be 100 years old, and he spent nearly all of those years in show business. Born Nathan Birnbaum on the Lower East Side of New York in 1896, he was one of 12 children in a family so poor that the kids would steal coal from a nearby yard to heat the apartment. His father, a coat presser in a sweatshop, died when George was 7. He picked up the name George Burns as a boy, borrowing from a brother's name and the Burns Brothers coal yard where they scavenged fuel. And by his teens, he was working vaudeville stages, trying every act he could dream up. Singing in a children's quartet, dancing, comedy patter, roller skating, even a trained seal act. Nothing stuck. He was, by his own cheerful admission, a failure on the vaudeville circuit for years. Everything changed in 1923 when he teamed up with a young Irish Catholic girl from San Francisco named Grace Ethel Cecile Rosalie Allen. Gracie had been performing with her sisters as part of a vaudeville act, and when she and George began working together, the original plan had George delivering the funny lines while Gracie fed him setups. It flopped. Then George had the insight that saved both their careers. Gracie was the one getting all the laughs with her reactions and ad-libs. He flipped the act, giving her the punchlines and taking the straight man role for himself. It was an act of professional humility that few performers would have managed, and it made them stars. Their act was built on a simple, endlessly renewable premise. Gracie would deliver absurd statements with utter sincerity, and George would react with patient, baffled exasperation. "Say goodnight, Gracie." "Good night, Gracie." Burns and Allen became one of the biggest acts in vaudeville, then transitioned seamlessly to radio in the 1930s, where their weekly show ran for nearly 2 decades, and then conquered television in the early 50s with the George Burns and Gracie Allen Show. That television program was quietly innovative. George would break the fourth wall and speak directly to the audience, commenting on the plot as it unfolded, a technique that would not become common again until shows like The Office and Fleabag, decades later. Gracie retired from performing in 1958 due to heart trouble and passed away in 1964 at the age of 62. George was devastated by her loss. For years, he visited her here at Forest Lawn every month, sometimes sitting on a bench and talking to her as though she were still in the next room. He once said that he told her everything that was going on in his life, and the only thing she never did was answer. After a long period of relative quiet, George launched one of the most remarkable comebacks in show business history. At 79, he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in The Sunshine Boys, stepping in at the last minute for his old friend Jack Benny, who had died before filming could begin. The Oscar launched an improbable second career as a movie star. He played God twice in the Oh God films, a role he inhabited with such twinkling authority that it seemed like typecasting. He continued performing well into his 90s, doing stand-up in Las Vegas and appearing on talk shows with the same timing he had polished over 8 decades. George Burns died on March 9, 1996, 49 days after his 100th birthday of cardiac arrest. He was laid to rest here beside Gracie, together again. Just a short walk from George and Gracie, still within the Freedom Mausoleum, we find the crypt of Chico Marx, the eldest of the performing Marx Brothers. The Marx Brothers were one of the most anarchic comedy teams in Hollywood history. Their films Duck Soup and A Night at the Opera remain touchstones of absurdist humor nearly a century later. Chico was the charmer, the one with the faux Italian accent and the surprisingly deft piano skills. Off-screen, he served as the unofficial business manager, negotiating the brothers' studio deals, though his legendary gambling habit meant he was perpetually broke, regardless of how much money rolled in. In their later years, Chico performed solo in nightclubs and casinos, partly because he loved performing and partly because he always needed the cash. He died of arteriosclerosis in 1961 at the age of 74 and was entombed here in the Freedom Mausoleum. Chico's brother Groucho, the rapid-fire wit with the grease paint mustache and ever-present cigar, is buried across town at Eden Memorial Park in Mission Hills, where we will visit later today. Groucho was the most famous of the Marx Brothers, and the one who built the longest solo career, hosting the television quiz show You Bet Your Life from 1950 to 1961. His one-liners are still quoted everywhere. "I refuse to join any club that would have me as a member." "Outside of a dog, a book is man's best friend. Inside of a dog, it's too dark to read." After years of declining health, Groucho died of pneumonia in 1977 at the age of 86. His passing was largely overshadowed in the news by the death of Elvis Presley just 3 days earlier, something Groucho, who spent his life competing for attention, probably would have found both exasperating and hilarious. His brother Harpo, the silent harp-playing clown whose comedy was entirely physical, has no grave at all. He was cremated, and his ashes were reportedly sprinkled into the sand trap at the 7th hole of a golf course in Rancho Mirage. Even in death, a bit of mischief. Let us make our way across the vast grounds of Forest Lawn, Glendale to the Great Mausoleum. Parts of this enormous structure are restricted to the public, but on the Holly Terrace level, in the columbarium of the Nativity, rest the ashes of one of Hollywood's original comic geniuses, W.C. Fields. If you grew up watching old movies on television, you know that bulbous nose, that perpetual scowl, and that muttering, exasperated delivery that made every line sound like a man losing a long argument with the universe itself. Fields was born William Claude Dukenfield in Philadelphia in 1880 and ran away from home as a boy after a violent altercation with his father. He survived on the streets by teaching himself to juggle, and by his late teens he was one of the most accomplished jugglers in the world, performing in vaudeville theaters across America and Europe. He played before European royalty and headlined at the Ziegfeld Follies on Broadway. But juggling was only the vehicle. The comedy was always the real act, and by the time he turned to films in the 1920s, he had perfected the persona that would make him immortal. The misanthropic, gin-soaked con artist who viewed the world as a vast conspiracy designed to annoy him. Children were the enemy. Dogs were worse. Sobriety was an affliction to be avoided at all costs. His best-known films, It's a Gift, The Bank Dick, My Little Chickadee with Mae West, and Never Give a Sucker an Even Break, are built around his magnificent, mumbling irritation with the entire human race. In real life, Fields was not far from his screen persona. He drank prodigiously, feuded with nearly everyone, and distrusted banks so deeply that he reportedly maintained hundreds of small savings accounts under false names in cities across the country. A popular legend holds that his epitaph reads, "On the whole, I'd rather be in Philadelphia," but that was an old joke he once made in a magazine article. It is not actually inscribed anywhere on his memorial. Fields died on Christmas Day, 1946, at the age of 66. The cause was a stomach hemorrhage related to decades of heavy drinking. He once said, "I was in love with a beautiful blonde once. She drove me to drink. 'Tis the one thing I'm indebted to her for." Still at Forest Lawn, Glendale, stepping outside now to the garden areas, we find the grave of Red Skelton. For more than 2 decades, the Red Skelton Show was a Tuesday night staple, first on CBS and then NBC, running from 1951 to 1971. Skelton created a gallery of comic characters, Clem Cadiddlehopper, Freddie the Freeloader, the Mean Whittle Kid, that became part of the national vocabulary. He was a gentle, physical comedian in the tradition of the silent film clowns he adored, and he always closed his show the same way: a quiet, sincere, good night, and may God bless. What many viewers never knew was that Skelton endured tremendous personal sorrow. His 9-year-old son Richard died of leukemia in 1958, a loss that haunted him for the rest of his life. Skelton continued performing on stage well into his 80s, and also became a prolific painter, producing thousands of works, many of them clown portraits. He died of pneumonia in 1997 at the age of 84. We are going to leave Forest Lawn, Glendale for a while, but we will be back. Let us head over the hill to the Hollywood Hills, where another branch of the Forest Lawn family sits nestled among slopes near Griffith Park. This is Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills, and in the Court of Valor section we find the great stone face himself, Buster Keaton. Alongside Charlie Chaplin and Harold Lloyd, Buster Keaton is considered one of the 3 greatest comic filmmakers of the silent era, and many critics put him at the very top. He earned his nickname as a toddler performing with his parents in a vaudeville act called The Three Keatons. The story goes that he tumbled down a flight of stairs without crying, and Harry Houdini, who happened to be present, remarked, "That's a real Buster." The name stuck for life. What set Keaton apart from every other comedian of his generation was his willingness to risk his own neck for a gag. He performed all of his own stunts, dangling from trains, leaping between buildings, standing perfectly still as the entire facade of a 2-story house collapsed around him, missing him by inches thanks to a carefully positioned open window frame. That stunt from Steamboat Bill Jr. remains one of the most breathtaking moments in film history. Had the timing been off by a foot, it would have killed him. His 1926 film, The General, is regularly ranked among the greatest films ever made, in any genre. Keaton's career faltered when he signed with MGM and lost the creative control he needed to do his best work. And his personal life was troubled by alcoholism for a time. But he continued working into the 60s, and in 1959, he received an honorary Academy Award. Buster Keaton died from lung cancer in 1966 at the age of 70. Not far from Buster in these same Hollywood Hills grounds, we find another pioneer of screen comedy, Stan Laurel, the thin half of Laurel and Hardy. Born Arthur Stanley Jefferson in Ulverston, England in 1890, Laurel came to America as part of the Fred Karno vaudeville troupe, understudying for a young performer named Charlie Chaplin, who was the troupe's star. When Chaplin left for the movies, Laurel struck out on his own, kicking around Hollywood for years as a solo performer in short comedies, never quite finding the formula that would make him a star. Everything changed in 1927, when the Hal Roach Studio paired him with a heavy-set actor from Harlem, Georgia, named Oliver Norvell Hardy. The chemistry was immediate and electric. Together, Laurel and Hardy became arguably the most beloved comedy duo in film history, and certainly the most prolific, appearing in over 100 films together between 1927 and 1951. Their dynamic was simple and perfect. Hardy was the pompous, self-important one who fancied himself the leader, and Laurel was the childlike innocent who unwittingly caused disasters. Hardy would fix Laurel with a slow, exasperated stare directly into the camera, his famous burn, and audiences loved it. Their best films, Sons of the Desert, Way Out West, The Music Box, Babes in Toyland, are as funny today as they were 90 years ago. What audiences did not see was that Laurel was the creative force behind the team. He wrote and directed many of their films, crafted the gags, and supervised the editing. Hardy, by contrast, was content to show up, perform brilliantly, and then go play golf. It was a division of labor that worked perfectly for both of them. After Hardy's death from a stroke in 1957, Laurel retired from performing but remained sharp, funny, and remarkably accessible. He listed his telephone number in the Santa Monica phone book and happily chatted with any fan who called. He received letters from admirers around the world and answered everyone personally. In 1961, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences honored him with an honorary Oscar. Stan Laurel died of a heart attack on February 23, 1965, at the age of 74. A few days before his death, he told a visiting nurse that he wished he could go skiing. When she asked if he was a skier, he replied, "No, but I'd rather be doing that than this." Oliver Hardy's ashes were placed at Valhalla Memorial Park in North Hollywood, just a few miles from here. While we are at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills, let us pay our respects to Lucille Ball. Lucy is not typically classified as a stand-up comedian, but I Love Lucy was the most watched television comedy of its era, and a strong case can be made that Lucille Ball made more people laugh than anyone else in the 20th century. Before television made her an icon, she spent years in Hollywood as a contract player at RKO, appearing in dozens of mostly forgettable B pictures. She was known around the studios as the Queen of the Bees, talented, hard-working, but never quite a star. Radio changed her fortunes. Her show, My Favorite Husband, was popular enough that CBS wanted to bring it to television, but Lucy insisted that her real-life husband, the Cuban bandleader Desi Arnaz, play her TV husband as well. The network balked. They did not think a Cuban man and an American redhead would be believable as a married couple, but Lucy held firm. She and Desi formed Desilu Productions to produce the show themselves, and I Love Lucy debuted in October 1951. It was an immediate sensation. Lucy's physical comedy, stomping grapes in an Italian vineyard, stuffing chocolates on a runaway conveyor belt, getting her nose stuck in a loving cup, catching fire while standing too close to a barbecue, set the standard for television sitcoms that endures to this day. What is less well appreciated is how much power she wielded behind the camera. Desilu Productions pioneered the three-camera setup, the technique of filming before a live studio audience, and the practice of shooting on film rather than broadcasting live, which made syndicated reruns possible. After her divorce from Desi, Lucy bought out his share of the company, becoming the first woman to run a major television production studio. Under her leadership, Desilu produced not only her own subsequent shows, but also Star Trek and Mission: Impossible. She was, in every sense, a mogul. Lucille Ball died of a ruptured aorta on April 26, 1989, at the age of 77. The outpouring of grief was enormous. Flags were lowered at studios across Hollywood, and tributes poured in from around the world. Let us leave the Hollywood Hills now and drive about 20 minutes west into the Westwood neighborhood of Los Angeles, where a tiny cemetery hides behind office buildings just off Wilshire Boulevard. This is Pierce Brothers' Westwood Village Memorial Park, barely 2 acres in size, but packed with an almost absurd concentration of famous names. Marilyn Monroe is here, and Dean Martin, and dozens of others. But today, we are here for the comedians, and the first one is hard to miss. Rodney Dangerfield's grave is one of the most visited spots in this cemetery, and it is not hard to understand why. The man who got no respect finally gets plenty of it, from fans who still make the pilgrimage to pay tribute to one of the greatest stand-up comedians who ever lived. Born Jacob Rodney Cohen on Long Island in 1921, Dangerfield had one of the most unusual career arcs in comedy history. He first tried the business in the 1940s under the stage name Jack Roy, writing jokes and performing at Borscht Belt resorts in the Catskill Mountains. He could not gain traction. After more than a decade of struggle, he quit show business entirely, got married, and became an aluminum siding salesman in New Jersey. For 12 years, he sold siding, painted houses, and put comedy behind him. But the itch never fully went away. In his late 30s, he began writing jokes again, and by 1962, at the age of 40, he returned to comedy under a new name, Rodney Dangerfield, with a new act built around a single, devastatingly simple premise. Nobody gives him any respect. The persona was genius in its simplicity. The loosened tie, the bulging eyes, the nervous tugging at his collar, the machine gun delivery, all of it communicated a man under perpetual assault from every direction. His wife, his kids, his doctor, his dog, his neighborhood, his own body. Everyone and everything in Rodney's world treated him like garbage, and he made it the funniest thing on earth. My wife and I were happy for 20 years, then we met. I went to a fight the other night and a hockey game broke out. When I was born, I was so ugly the doctor slapped my mother. The jokes came in torrents, each one a tiny, perfect gem of comic construction. He became a fixture on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, making over 70 appearances, and a movie star through Caddyshack, in which his performance as the boorish country club developer Al Chervick nearly stole the picture from Bill Murray and Chevy Chase, and Back to School, in which he played a millionaire who enrolls in college alongside his son. But perhaps his most lasting contribution to comedy came through his New York club, Dangerfield's, which he opened in 1969. Through that club, he launched the careers of young comics who would go on to become superstars. Jim Carrey, Jerry Seinfeld, Sam Kinison, Roseanne Barr, Andrew Dice Clay, and many others. All of them credit Rodney as a pivotal figure in their development. Rodney died on October 5, 2004, at the age of 82, following complications from heart valve replacement surgery. His wife Joan said his last words were aimed at a visiting friend. "You're still not funnier than me." A short stroll from Rodney, in this same compact cemetery, we find Don Knotts. Millions of viewers loved him as the twitchy, bug-eyed Deputy Barney Fife on The Andy Griffith Show. Knotts won 5 Emmy Awards for that role, a record for a supporting actor in a comedy series that has never been broken. After leaving Mayberry, he appeared in Disney films like The Incredible Mr. Limpet and The Apple Dumpling Gang, and later joined the cast of Three's Company as the nosy landlord Ralph Furley. Before any of that, Knotts served in the United States Army during World War II, entertaining troops in the Pacific in a GI variety show called Stars and Gripes. He was a quiet, gentle man off-screen, nothing like the nervous characters he played so brilliantly. Don Knotts died from pulmonary and respiratory complications in 2006 at the age of 81. Nearby in this same Westwood cemetery rests Jack Lemmon, one of the finest comic actors Hollywood ever produced. His partnership with Walter Matthau gave us The Odd Couple and Grumpy Old Men, and his performance in Some Like It Hot is one of the funniest in all of cinema. Lemmon was also a tremendous dramatic actor, winning 2 Academy Awards. He died of cancer in 2001 at the age of 76. His great partner Walter Matthau rests just steps away. The two were friends for decades, and in death, they remain neighbors. Matthau won his own Oscar for The Fortune Cookie and became one of the most bankable comedy stars of the 70s. He died of a heart attack in 2000 at 79, just a year before Lemmon joined him here. One more stop in Westwood before we move on. Carroll O'Connor also rests in this little cemetery. His portrayal of Archie Bunker on All in the Family is one of the greatest comic performances in television history. The bigoted, blustering, secretly tender-hearted Queens dock worker who became a mirror for America in the 1970s. O'Connor won 4 Emmy Awards for the role and later won another for the dramatic series In the Heat of the Night. He died of a heart attack caused by complications of diabetes in 2001 at the age of 76. Leaving Westwood, let us head south to Culver City, to Holy Cross Cemetery, a Catholic burial ground that is home to quite a few Hollywood legends. Among its rolling hills, we find the grave of John Candy, one of the most lovable comic performers of the 1980s and early 90s. There are comedians who make you laugh, and there are comedians who make you feel like everything is going to be all right. John Candy was the second kind. Something about his enormous physical presence, combined with gentle eyes and a warm, self-deprecating manner, made audiences want to be his friend. Candy came out of the Second City comedy troupe in Toronto and became a star on SCTV, the Canadian sketch comedy show that ran from 1976 to 1984. His characters on that program, The glad-handing Johnny LaRue, the polka-playing Schmeng brother, the blowhard Mayor Tommy Shanks, were consistently the most popular creations on the show. His transition to the big screen was seamless. In Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, he played Del Griffith, the annoying but warm-hearted shower curtain ring salesman opposite Steve Martin. That film contains what many consider Candy's finest moment, a scene near the end where the comedy drops away and the loneliness behind Del's cheerful exterior is laid bare. Candy played it with such unforced emotion that Martin later called it one of the most moving things he had ever witnessed from a fellow actor. Other beloved films include Uncle Buck, The Great Outdoors, Spaceballs, and Cool Runnings. At 6'3" and well over 300 pounds for much of his adult life, Candy struggled with his weight throughout his career. On March 4, 1994, while filming a comedy in Durango, Mexico, he suffered a heart attack in his sleep. John Candy was just 43 years old. While we are at Holy Cross, let us walk over to the mausoleum to find Ray Bolger, the Scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz. Bolger was a dancer and comedian whose loose-limbed, rubbery physicality made him one of Broadway and Hollywood's most distinctive performers. His rendition of If I Only Had a Brain is one of the most beloved moments in cinema history. He was also a Broadway star, best known for the musical Where's Charlie? In his later years, he made guest appearances on television shows including The Partridge Family and Little House on the Prairie. Ray Bolger died of cancer in 1987 at the age of 83. Let us head up now to the San Fernando Valley, to the grounds of the historic Mission San Fernando Rey de España in Mission Hills. Behind the chapel of this 18th century Spanish mission, a rose garden serves as the final resting place of a man many consider the greatest entertainer of the 20th century, Bob Hope. When his wife Dolores asked him late in life where he wanted to be buried, Hope replied, "Surprise me." It was a typical line from a man who spent nearly a century cracking jokes. Born Leslie Towns Hope in Eltham, England in 1903, he immigrated with his family to Cleveland, Ohio as a boy. As a young man, he tried his hand at boxing under the name Packy East before discovering that making people laugh hurt less than getting punched. He worked his way through vaudeville and onto Broadway, and in 1938 he made his feature film debut in The Big Broadcast of 1938, in which he sang Thanks for the Memory with Shirley Ross. The song became his lifelong theme. From there, his career was a rocket. The road to Pictures with Bing Crosby, we visited Bing earlier at Holy Cross, were among the most popular comedies of the 40s and 50s, built on a chemistry of ad-libs and mutual ribbing that felt spontaneous even when it was carefully rehearsed. Hope's television specials on NBC drew enormous audiences for decades, and his monologues, topical, sharp, and delivered with that confident, ski-slope-nosed grin, made him the most recognized comedian in the country. But it was his work with the troops that cemented Bob Hope in the hearts of the nation more than any film or television appearance ever could. Beginning in World War II and continuing through Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War, Hope traveled to every conflict zone where American soldiers were stationed, bringing comedy shows to forward operating bases, aircraft carriers, and field hospitals. For many servicemen and women stationed thousands of miles from home, a Bob Hope USO show was the brightest moment of their deployment. He made these trips at considerable personal risk and at no charge. Congress named him an honorary veteran in 1997, the only person ever to receive that distinction. Over his career, Hope accumulated honors at a rate that seems almost comical. 5 honorary Academy Awards, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, a Congressional Gold Medal, an honorary knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II, and 58 honorary degrees. He holds 4 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, more than any other entertainer. Bob Hope lived to be 100 years old, passing away on July 27, 2003 of pneumonia. He rests here in the Rose Garden, near a chapel of the same mission that appeared in his 1940 film Ghostbreakers. Just around the corner from the mission, at the San Fernando Mission Cemetery, we find the grave of George Gobel. If you watched The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson in the 70s, you likely remember the night when Gobel followed appearances by Bob Hope and Dean Martin. Slouching in his chair, looking thoroughly outmatched, Goebel turned to Carson and said, "Do you ever get the feeling that the world was a tuxedo and you were a pair of brown shoes?" The line brought the house down and remains one of the most quoted moments in Tonight Show history. That self-deprecating, slightly bewildered persona was Goebel's stock in trade. In the 50s, The George Gobel Show was a prime-time hit on NBC, earning him an Emmy. He died following complications of bypass surgery in 1991 at the age of 71. Let us head back into central Los Angeles now, to one of the city's most historically significant cemeteries, Hollywood Forever, on Santa Monica Boulevard, right next door to Paramount Studios. This is where Hollywood began burying its own, and walking these grounds feels like turning the pages of film history. We have several stops to make here, so let us take our time. Our first visit at Hollywood Forever is to the grave of Mel Blanc, the man of 1,000 voices. If you grew up watching Looney Tunes cartoons, and if you are of a certain age you almost certainly did, then Mel Blanc was quite possibly the single most important voice in your childhood. He was Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, Tweety Bird, Sylvester the Cat, Yosemite Sam, Foghorn Leghorn, Wile E. Coyote, the Roadrunner, Pepe Le Pew, Marvin the Martian, Speedy Gonzales, and dozens more. For nearly 50 years, Blanc provided virtually every major male voice in the Warner Brothers cartoon stable, creating characters so distinct and so indelible that they became woven into the fabric of the American language. Before Blanc arrived at Warner Brothers in 1937, the studio had used a rotating cast of voice actors. Blanc's extraordinary range. He could shift from the streetwise Brooklyn twang of Bugs to the slobbering lisp of Daffy to the sputtering frustration of Porky with seamless ease, made everyone else redundant. He insisted on, and received, an on-screen credit, making him the first voice actor to be credited in cartoons. Voice characterization by Mel Blanc became one of the most seen credits in Hollywood history. Beyond the Looney Tunes, Blanc voiced Barney Rubble on the Flintstones, appeared regularly as a variety of characters on the Jack Benny program on radio and television, and provided voices for Hanna-Barbera cartoons including Speed Buggy, Captain Caveman, and Secret Squirrel. In 1961, he was nearly killed in a devastating car accident on Sunset Boulevard near the intersection known as Dead Man's Curve. He lay in a coma for 3 weeks, completely unresponsive to doctors and family members who tried to reach him. Then, according to a story that has become part of Hollywood legend, one of his doctors tried something different. Addressing Blanc not by his real name but as Bugs Bunny, the doctor asked, "How are you feeling today, Bugs?" From the depths of unconsciousness, Blanc reportedly replied in Bugs's voice, just fine, Doc." Whether every detail of that account is precisely true, and some scholars have questioned parts of it, the fact that it has been told and retold for more than 60 years says something about how completely Mel Blanc was identified with the characters he created. He recovered from the accident and continued working for nearly 3 more decades. Mel Blanc died of heart disease and emphysema in 1989 at the age of 81. Walking deeper into Hollywood Forever, past mausoleums and monuments dating to the earliest days of the film industry, we come to the Beth Olam section. Here rests Estelle Getty, who for 7 seasons played Sophia Petrillo on The Golden Girls, the sharp-tongued Sicilian mother who could cut anyone down to size with a single sentence beginning, "Picture it, Sicily, 1922. In reality, Getty was actually a year younger than Bea Arthur, who played her daughter Dorothy, a fact that required considerable work from the makeup department each week. Getty won an Emmy for the role and became one of the most beloved figures on television. Before The Golden Girls, she had spent decades working in theater without breaking through, not finding fame until she was in her 60s, a reminder that some careers bloom late. Estelle Getty died of dementia in 2008 at the age of 84. Also at Hollywood Forever, we find the memorial to one of comedy's most confounding originals, Andy Kaufman. Calling Kaufman a comedian is a bit like calling a hurricane a light breeze. He did not tell jokes in any traditional sense. He performed elaborate, sometimes bewildering, sometimes infuriating pieces of performance art that happened to take place on comedy stages and television variety shows. He wrestled women. He read The Great Gatsby aloud to increasingly hostile audiences until they walked out. He played the sweet foreign man Latka Gravas on the sitcom Taxi, while simultaneously terrorizing the professional wrestling world as his obnoxious alter ego, Tony Clifton. Nobody was ever quite sure when Kaufman was being sincere, and that was the entire point. He was diagnosed with a rare form of lung cancer, large cell carcinoma, and died in 1984 at the age of 35. Even his death was met with skepticism by fans who suspected it was just another Kaufman put-on. It was not. Let us leave Hollywood forever and drive southeast to Inglewood Park Cemetery. In the devotion section at the west end of the grounds, we find Redd Foxx. If you watch television in the 1970s, you know Fred Sanford, the cantankerous, junk-hoarding widower on Sanford and Son, who clutched his chest and hollered to his late wife Elizabeth every time his son Lamont did something to aggravate him. That character earned Fox a Golden Globe and made him one of the biggest stars on television. But Redd Foxx had been a comedy legend long before television discovered him. Born John Elroy Sanford in St. Louis in 1922, yes, the character's last name came from his own, he spent decades working nightclubs as one of the rawest, most uncompromising stand-up comedians in America. He recorded more than 50 party records, albums of material far too blue for radio or television, that sold millions of copies through word of mouth and under-the-counter sales. He was a phenomenon on the Chitlin circuit and in black nightclubs nationwide, and his influence on the next generation of black comedians was immense. Richard Pryor, whom we just visited in Peoria, idolized Foxx and credited him as a major influence. Eddie Murphy has said the same. The circumstances of Foxx's death carry their own dark comedy. On the set of his 1991 sitcom The Royal Family, he suffered a massive heart attack during a rehearsal break. His castmates and crew, so familiar with his old Fred Sanford chest-clutching routine from Sanford and Son, initially believed he was doing a bit. By the time they realized it was real, it was too late. Redd Foxx died at the age of 68. The IRS had been pursuing him for years over unpaid taxes, and his financial situation at the time of death was so dire that friends had to raise money for his funeral. From Inglewood, let us travel to the Hillside Memorial Park in Culver City, a Jewish cemetery easily recognizable from the nearby freeway by its spectacular monument to Al Jolson. Among the many notable figures buried at Hillside, we are here for three of comedy's finest. First, Jack Benny. For most of the 20th century, Jack Benny was the gold standard of American comedy, the comedian other comedians studied, admired, and tried to learn from. His radio program, which debuted in 1932, ran for more than 2 decades and was one of the most popular in the country. His television show, which followed, continued his reign through the 50s and 60s. What made Benny unique was that his comedy resided not in jokes, but in character. His persona, the perennial 39-year-old who was insufferably cheap, played the violin with exquisite awfulness and responded to every indignity with a slow-burning stare of disbelief, was a masterwork of comic construction, refined over decades until every pause, every glance, every exasperated "well" was perfectly calibrated. His timing was beyond compare, and he knew that silence could be funnier than any words. The most celebrated moment of his career demonstrates this perfectly. On his radio show, a robber confronts Benny and demands, "Your money or your life?" The audience, knowing Benny's legendarily cheap character, begins to laugh at the setup. Then comes silence. The pause stretches on and on, the laughter in the studio building and building as the audience realizes what is happening. Benny's character is genuinely weighing the options. Finally, the robber repeats the demand, "Well?" And Benny snaps back, "I'm thinking it over." That silence is often called the longest sustained laugh in the history of broadcast comedy. Off-screen, Benny was, by all accounts, one of the most generous men in Hollywood, the polar opposite of his penny-pinching character. He gave freely to charities, was beloved by his fellow performers, and maintained one of the warmest friendships in show business with Fred Allen, whose grave we will visit later on our tour. Benny died of pancreatic cancer on December 26, 1974, at the age of 80. When his will was read, it contained a final romantic gesture. He had arranged for a single long-stemmed red rose to be delivered to his wife, Mary Livingston, every day for the rest of her life. The roses kept arriving for years after his death. A short distance from Jack Benny at Hillside Memorial, we find Milton Berle, Mr. Television, Uncle Milty, the man who practically willed an entire industry into existence through the force of his personality. In the late 1940s, television sets were still a novelty item, expensive, unreliable, and available in only a handful of markets. Then came the Texaco Star Theater. Milton Berle's variety show debuted on NBC in 1948 and became the first true television phenomenon. His show was so wildly popular that it was credited with single-handedly driving television set sales across the country. Appliance dealers reportedly put signs in their windows reading, "Watch Berle on our TVs tonight," to lure customers in. On Tuesday nights, restaurants emptied out, movie theaters went dark, and the nation, or at least the growing portion of it that had television, gathered around the flickering screen to watch Uncle Milty. Berle had been in show business since he was 5 years old, performing in vaudeville and silent films as a child actor. By the time television found him, he had been performing for nearly 4 decades. He was a shameless ham. He would wear outlandish costumes, put on dresses, mug outrageously for the camera, and steal jokes from other comedians with such brazenness that his reputation as a joke thief became a joke in itself. "Berle steals from everybody," the old gag went, and everybody steals from Berle. But his energy was irresistible, and he understood the possibilities of the new medium better than anyone alive. He knew that television was intimate, that it came into people's living rooms, and that a performer who could make a family feel like he was part of their household would own the medium. For a few glorious years in the late 40s and early 50s, Milton Berle did exactly that. His dominance faded as the novelty of television wore off, and subtler comedians like Jack Benny and Lucille Ball found their footing on the small screen, but his place in history was secure. He was inducted into the Television Academy Hall of Fame and received the Friars Club's first-ever Lifetime Achievement Award. Milton Berle died of colon cancer in 2002 at the age of 93, having spent 88 of those years in show business. Also at Hillside, we find Shelley Berman, a comedian whose influence far outstripped his name recognition. In the late 1950s, Berman was at the absolute forefront of stand-up comedy. His 1959 album Inside Shelley Berman was the first comedy recording ever to be certified gold, and it won a Grammy Award. His style was unusual for the time. Rather than rattling off one-liners, he performed character pieces and one-sided telephone conversations that anticipated the observational comedy boom by decades. Much later in his career, he found a new audience playing Larry David's father on Curb Your Enthusiasm. Shelley Berman died in 2017 at the age of 92. Now let us drive back north through the valley to Eden Memorial Park in Mission Hills, where we noted earlier that Groucho Marx is buried. We are returning to find 2 more comedy legends. First, Lenny Bruce. In many ways, Bruce was the most important stand-up comedian of the 20th century, not because he was the funniest, though he could be brilliantly, startlingly funny, but because he changed what a comedian was permitted to say and think about on stage. Before Bruce, stand-up comedy was mostly one-liners, funny stories, and character bits, entertaining but rarely challenging. Bruce turned comedy into a vehicle for social criticism. In the late 50s and early 60s, he pushed relentlessly against the obscenity laws of the time, bringing profanity, frank discussions of sex, sharp observations about race, and blistering critiques of organized religion into his nightclub act. The authorities did not appreciate it. Bruce was arrested for obscenity in San Francisco in 1961, in Chicago in 1962, in Los Angeles in 1962, and most consequentially, in New York in 1964, where he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 4 months in a workhouse. The New York trial became a cause célèbre, with artists and intellectuals rallying to his defense. But the damage was done. Clubs were afraid to book him, and he could barely earn a living. He spent his final years broke, obsessed with his legal battles, reading courtroom transcripts on stage instead of performing comedy. On August 3, 1966, Lenny Bruce was found dead in his Hollywood home from an accidental morphine overdose. He was 40 years old. Decades later, in 2003, New York Governor George Pataki granted Bruce a posthumous pardon, the first in the state's history, acknowledging that his prosecution had been a violation of free speech. Every comedian who has ever used a stage to challenge the status quo walks a path that Lenny Bruce cut through the brush. Also here at Eden Memorial rests Phil Silvers, a name that will bring an immediate smile to anyone who remembers Sergeant Bilko. On The Phil Silvers Show, which ran from 1955 to 1959, Silvers played the fast-talking, scheming master sergeant at a sleepy army post who ran every con in the book, while his commanding officer remained blissfully oblivious. The show was a critical and commercial smash, and Silvers won 2 Emmy Awards for the role. Before conquering television, he had been a major presence on Broadway, winning a Tony Award for Top Banana. His rapid-fire delivery and sly conspiratorial grin made him one of the most watchable performers of his era. Phil Silvers died of natural causes in 1985 at the age of 73. Leaving Eden Memorial and Los Angeles behind for a while, let us head to the coast and then up the Pacific Highway. Our next stop is in San Diego, at El Camino Memorial Park in Sorrento Valley. Here rests Phyllis Diller, who did not become a comedian until she was 37 years old. She was a housewife with 5 children who took a comedy class on a lark and discovered she had a gift. Within a few years, she was one of the most famous comedians in America, performing 100 shows a year and turning up on every variety show on television. Her act was unlike anything audiences had seen from a woman in comedy. The wild, electrified hair, the long cigarette holder, the cackling, self-deprecating laugh, the jokes about her fictional husband Fang and her own supposed ugliness. It was all deliberate artifice, a carefully constructed persona that gave her license to be as outrageous as any male comic. She opened doors for every female stand-up who came after her. Phyllis Diller died peacefully in her sleep in 2012 at the age of 95. From San Diego, let us make a great leap eastward. We are flying across the country to Martha's Vineyard, the island off the coast of Massachusetts. In the quiet Able Hill Cemetery in the village of Chilmark, shaded by old trees and within earshot of the Atlantic, we find the grave of John Belushi. John Belushi was a force of nature. There is really no other way to describe him. He was one of the original 7 cast members of Saturday Night Live when it debuted on NBC in October 1975. And from the very first broadcast, he was the show's wildest, most unpredictable element. Born in Chicago to Albanian immigrant parents, he had grown up playing high school football in Wheaton, Illinois, before discovering that he had an extraordinary gift for making people laugh. He honed that gift at Second City, Chicago's legendary comedy theater, and then in the off-Broadway National Lampoon show, Lemmings, before Lorne Michaels cast him in the new sketch comedy program that would change television. On Saturday Night Live, Belushi was volcanic. His samurai warrior sketches, in which he played a sword-wielding samurai working improbable jobs like delicatessen counterman and hotel desk clerk, became instant classics. His dead-on physical impression of Joe Cocker was so good that he performed it alongside the real Cocker on the show. His cafeteria scene, his killer bee costume, his manic energy in every sketch. These were the moments that made SNL must-see television in its early years. With fellow cast member Dan Aykroyd, he created the Blues Brothers, characters that began as a musical sketch and grew into a hit album and then a hit film. The 1980 comedy that featured one of the most spectacular car chases ever put on screen. He also starred in National Lampoon's Animal House in 1978, where his performance as the anarchic, food fight-starting fraternity brother Bluto Blutarsky launched 1,000 toga parties on college campuses across America. But Belushi struggled terribly with drug abuse, and his intake escalated as his fame grew. Friends, colleagues, and family members tried to intervene, but Belushi was resistant to help. On March 5, 1982, he was found dead in Bungalow 3 at the Chateau Marmont Hotel on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. A woman named Kathy Smith had injected him with a combination of cocaine and heroin known as a speedball. Smith later pleaded no contest to involuntary manslaughter and served 15 months in prison. John Belushi was 33 years old. He was buried here on Martha's Vineyard, an island he had fallen in love with, far from the Hollywood chaos that consumed him. Dan Aykroyd led the funeral procession, playing a tape of the Blues Brothers song 2,000 Light Years from Home. From Martha's Vineyard, let us cross to the mainland and make our way down the Connecticut coast. At Riverside Cemetery in Old Saybrook, we find the grave of Art Carney, one of the earliest and greatest comedians in television history. Carney played Ed Norton on The Honeymooners, the cheerful, perpetually optimistic sewer worker who lived upstairs from Ralph and Alice Cramden and who served as the perfect foil to Jackie Gleason's blustering, scheme-hatching bus driver. Norton was a man of elaborate rituals. Before doing the simplest task, he would engage in an extended preparatory routine, adjusting his stance, flexing his fingers, swinging his arms, that drove Ralph to the brink of madness. His legendary wind-up before bowling, which involved a full minute of gyrations and false starts, became one of the most imitated comic bits in television history. The character was so influential that it directly inspired Barney Rubble on the Flintstones. Hanna-Barbera essentially adapted the Honeymooners into an animated Stone Age setting, and the cartoon character Yogi Bear. What many people do not know about Art Carney is that he served in the United States Army during World War II and was wounded during the Normandy invasion, taking shrapnel in his right leg that left him with a limp for the rest of his life. He also struggled with alcoholism for many years, a battle that interrupted his career more than once. But he kept coming back. After The Honeymooners, he had a memorable role on one of the most poignant episodes of The Twilight Zone, Night of the Meek, in which he played a drunken department store Santa who is granted the ability to give everyone what they truly want for Christmas. Later still, he won the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1974 for the film Harry and Tonto, in which he played a retired schoolteacher who takes a cross-country road trip with his cat. That he beat heavyweights like Al Pacino, who was nominated for The Godfather Part 2, and Jack Nicholson, nominated for Chinatown, remains one of the great upsets in Oscar history. Art Carney died peacefully in his sleep on November 9, 2003, at the age of 85. Heading north along the Connecticut coast to Stamford, Connecticut, we find the Long Ridge Union Cemetery and the grave of one of the most important comic minds of the late 20th century, Gene Wilder. Born Jerome Silberman in Milwaukee in 1933, the boy who would become Gene Wilder discovered acting when his mother fell ill, and a doctor told him, at 8 years old, try to make her laugh. It was advice he took to heart for the rest of his life. He studied theater in England and at the Actors Studio in New York before adopting his stage name, borrowing from the novelist Thomas Wolfe and the playwright Thornton Wilder. His collaborations with Mel Brooks changed comedy forever. In The Producers, Wilder played the timid, hysterical accountant Leo Bloom, earning an Academy Award nomination and establishing himself as a major talent overnight. In Young Frankenstein, which he co-wrote with Brooks, he played the increasingly unhinged Dr. Frederick Frankenstein with a combination of intelligence and lunacy that made the film one of the finest comedies of the 70s. And in Blazing Saddles, his Jim, the Waco Kid, provided a sardonic center amid the surrounding anarchy. But it is his performance as Willy Wonka in the 1971 film Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory that became his most enduring legacy. Wilder agreed to take the role on one condition, that Wonka's first entrance involve him walking with a limp, planting his cane, and suddenly doing a forward somersault. When asked why, he explained that from that moment on, nobody in the audience would know whether Wonka was telling the truth about anything. That instinct, the desire to keep everyone slightly off balance, is what made his Wonka one of the most memorable characters in cinema history. Wilder was married to Gilda Radner, whom we visited at her grave near Chicago, and her death from ovarian cancer in 1989 devastated him. He poured his grief into advocacy, helping establish the Gilda's Club network of cancer support communities that still serves families today. Gene Wilder died of complications from Alzheimer's disease on August 29, 2016, at the age of 83. His family revealed that he had kept his diagnosis private for 3 years because he could not bear the thought of someone seeing him and feeling sad. Let us head south into New York City now, the birthplace of American stand-up comedy. In the Bronx, at Woodlawn Cemetery, a magnificent burial ground that is home to jazz greats like Duke Ellington, titans of industry, and celebrated literary figures, we find the grave of Fanny Brice. Long before Barbra Streisand portrayed her in the 1968 film Funny Girl, and long before most people alive today were born, Fanny Brice was one of the biggest stars in American entertainment. Born Fania Borich on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1891, she grew up in a world of immigrant tenements and street corner performers. She won an amateur night contest as a teenager, and by 1910 she was performing in the Ziegfeld Follies, the most prestigious variety show in the country. Brice was not conventionally beautiful. She would later have her nose surgically altered, a decision Dorothy Parker reportedly responded to by saying she had cut off her nose to spite her race. But she was ferociously talented. She could deliver broad physical comedy one moment and an achingly beautiful ballad the next. Her rendition of My Man, a torch song about unrequited love, was one of the most celebrated performances in Follies history and drew heavily on the pain of her own troubled marriage to the gambler and convicted fraudster Nicky Arnstein. Her most enduring creation was Baby Snooks, a bratty, mischievous child character she played on radio for nearly 2 decades, from the early 30s until her death. The character was so popular that it kept her on the air long after her stage career had wound down. Fanny Brice died of a cerebral hemorrhage on May 29, 1951, at the age of 59. Streisand's Oscar-winning portrayal in Funny Girl and the subsequent 1975 sequel Funny Lady introduced Brice to generations who never saw her perform. Taking the train out to Queens, we arrive at Mount St. Mary Cemetery in Flushing. Here rests one of the most innovative minds in the entire history of television, Ernie Kovacs. In the 1950s, when most TV comedy consisted of a comedian standing at a microphone delivering jokes to a studio audience, Kovacs was doing something that nobody had attempted before. He treated the television camera not as a passive recording device, but as an active comedy partner, tilting it, playing with perspective, using superimpositions and editing tricks to create visual gags that were decades ahead of their time. He built sets on angles so that when the camera was tilted, gravity appeared to work sideways. Liquids poured at impossible angles, objects rolled uphill. He created an entire character, the poet Percy Dovetonsils, who existed purely as a vehicle for absurdist wordplay. In one of his most celebrated programs, he broadcast a full half-hour of television without a single spoken word, using only music, sound effects, and visual comedy. Kovacs was also one of the first performers to break the fourth wall on television, acknowledging the cameras, the crew, and the artificiality of the medium itself. In doing so, he anticipated the self-referential, meta-comedic style that would not become mainstream for another 40 years. David Letterman has cited Kovacs as his single biggest influence. Conan O'Brien, Jimmy Fallon, and every late-night host who has ever smashed something, played with camera tricks, or done a bit that acknowledges the absurdity of television itself is operating in territory that Ernie Kovacs explored first. His personal life was turbulent. He waged a long custody battle for his daughters and accumulated enormous debts, partly from funding his own television experiments. But his creative output was astonishing. On the night of January 13, 1962, Kovacs attended a party in Beverly Hills, left sometime after midnight, and lost control of his Chevrolet station wagon on a rain-slicked curve on Santa Monica Boulevard. He was killed instantly. He was just 42 years old. According to the officers who arrived at the scene, his ever-present unlit cigar was still clenched in his hand. Still in Queens, we make our way to Beth David Cemetery. Here lies Henny Youngman, the undisputed king of the one-liner. For more than 60 years, Youngman walked onto stages carrying his violin, which he could actually play quite well, and delivered rapid-fire jokes, each one a perfectly constructed miniature. Take my wife, please. A doctor gave a man 6 months to live. The man couldn't pay his bill. The doctor gave him another 6 months. He never evolved his act, never tried to be anything more or less than a flawless joke delivery machine. And audiences loved him for it, decade after decade after decade. Henny Youngman died of pneumonia in 1998 at the age of 91, still working right up to the end. From Queens, let us head across New York Harbor to Staten Island. At the United Hebrew Cemetery, we find the grave of Toady Fields. In the 1960s and 70s, Fields was one of the most popular female comedians in America, a brash, big-voiced regular on The Ed Sullivan Show and a headliner in Las Vegas. She built her act on self-deprecating humor about her weight and her marriage, and she could hold a room like very few women in comedy could at that time. Her career was devastated by a series of health crises. She lost a leg to complications from a blood clot, then lost sight in one eye, then endured more surgeries. Through every setback, she kept getting back on stage. Toady Fields died of a heart attack in 1978 at the age of just 48. Our New York tour now takes us north to Valhalla, in Westchester County, to the stately Kensico Cemetery. Nestled among rolling hills, this beautiful cemetery holds a remarkable number of famous people, and we are here to visit two of comedy's greats. First, Danny Kaye. For a generation of children who grew up in the 1950s, Danny Kaye was pure magic, the funniest, most delightful performer in the world. Born David Daniel Kaminsky in Brooklyn in 1911, the son of Ukrainian Jewish immigrants, he began entertaining as a teenager in the Catskills and worked his way through nightclubs and Broadway before Hollywood discovered him. His films, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, The Court Jester, White Christmas, Hans Christian Andersen, The Inspector General, showcased a talent so versatile it almost defied classification. He could sing beautifully, dance with athletic grace, perform tongue-twisting patter songs at a speed that seemed to defy human capacity, assume a dozen different accents in the space of a single scene, and pivot from broad slapstick to genuine tenderness in the space of a breath. His routine in The Court Jester, the pellet with the poisons in the vessel with the pestle, the chalice from the palace has the brew that is true, is one of the great tongue-twisting comedy bits ever committed to film. And Kaye performed it with such precision that it looked effortless. Beyond the entertainment world, Kaye devoted enormous energy to humanitarian causes. He was appointed UNICEF's first-ever Goodwill Ambassador in 1954, and he took the role seriously, traveling to Africa, Asia, and South America on behalf of the world's children. He was also, somewhat surprisingly, a serious amateur cook, a licensed pilot, and part owner of the Seattle Mariners baseball team. Danny Kaye died of heart failure brought on by hepatitis in 1987 at the age of 74. A short walk from Danny Kaye at Kensico, we find Zero Mostel. Born Samuel Joel Mostel in Brooklyn in 1915, he picked up the nickname Zero as a young man, a joke about his academic performance, or possibly his prospects, depending on who was telling the story. He certainly proved the name wrong. A big bear-like man with a face that seemed to be made of India rubber, Mostel was one of the most acclaimed and explosive performers in Broadway history. He originated the role of Tevye the Milkman in the original 1964 production of Fiddler on the Roof, bringing a volcanic combination of humor, warmth, and spiritual anguish to the part that defined the role for all time. He also played Max Ballastock in the original 1968 stage production of Mel Brooks's The Producers, delivering a performance of such outrageous comic energy, physically hurling himself around the stage, mugging wildly, treating every line as though his life depended on it, that it practically reinvented what a Broadway musical comedy could be. Earlier in his career, Mostel had been severely damaged by the Hollywood blacklist. In 1955, he was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee and asked to name names, to identify colleagues who he believed held communist sympathies. He refused, famously telling the committee, "I am a man of 1,000 faces, none of them an informer." His defiance cost him years of film and television work. He never forgave the entertainment industry for what he saw as its cowardice during that era. His final film role was in The Front, a 1976 comedy starring Woody Allen about the blacklist itself, a fitting bookend. Zero Mostel died from a cardiac event on September 8, 1977, at the age of 62. He had been preparing to open in a new Broadway play at the time. From Westchester, let us drive south across the George Washington Bridge and into New Jersey. At the George Washington Memorial Park in Paramus, we find Jackie Gleason, the Great One, Ralph Kramden, Minnesota Fats, Reggie Van Gleason III, the Poor Soul. Jackie Gleason was a titanic force in American entertainment, a self-taught actor, comedian, musician, and composer who dominated the early decades of television with a combination of outsized talent and outsized personality. He grew up poor in Brooklyn, raised largely by his mother after his father walked out when Jackie was 9, a desertion that left emotional scars he carried for life and that informed the vulnerability beneath Ralph Kramden's bluster. Gleason dropped out of school to pursue show business, working his way through vaudeville and nightclubs until television found him in the early 50s. The Honeymooners, which began as a recurring sketch on the Jackie Gleason Show before becoming its own series, gave Gleason his greatest creation. Ralph Kramden, the Brooklyn bus driver with big dreams and a short fuse. Ralph was always scheming, to get rich quick, to impress his lodge brothers, to prove he was destined for something better than driving a bus through the streets of Brooklyn. And he always failed, spectacularly and hilariously. But what elevated the character beyond sitcom cliché was the tenderness beneath the bombast. When Ralph turned to his wife Alice and said, "Baby, you're the greatest," the audience believed him because Gleason made them believe. That combination, the big dreams, the spectacular failures, the underlying sweetness, made Ralph Kramden one of the all-time great comic characters, and the show's DNA is visible in everything from the Flintstones to All in the Family to the King of Queens. Gleason was also a formidable dramatic actor. His performance as Minnesota Fats in The Hustler earned him an Academy Award nomination and remains one of the coolest, most contained performances in 60s cinema. He died of colon and liver cancer in 1987 at the age of 71. He had originally been buried in Florida, where he had lived for years, but was eventually moved here to this New Jersey cemetery, closer to the Brooklyn streets that shaped him. Continuing through New Jersey, we arrive at Greenwood Cemetery in Hamilton Township. Here rests Lou Costello, the round, panicky half of Abbott and Costello. If you have ever heard the phrase, "Who's on first?" you have heard the most famous comedy routine in American history. That sketch, a masterpiece of verbal confusion about a baseball team whose players bear names like Who, What, and I Don't Know, has been performed, quoted, parodied, and celebrated since Abbott and Costello first refined it on the burlesque circuit in the late 1930s. It was so beloved that a copy of the routine is preserved in the Baseball Hall of Fame, and the Library of Congress selected it for preservation as a culturally significant recording. Abbott and Costello were the biggest box office draw in America in the early 40s, bigger than any dramatic star. They made 36 films together, from Buck Privates to Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and their popularity during the war years rivaled that of any entertainer in the country. Lou was the funny one, short, round, excitable, perpetually confused, perpetually getting slapped by the tall, smooth-talking Bud Abbott. The audience always rooted for Lou. Off-screen, he endured unimaginable heartbreak. In November 1943, his infant son, Lou Jr., just 1 year old, drowned in the family swimming pool. The tragedy occurred on the afternoon of a scheduled broadcast of their weekly radio show. Lou was told the news and was given the option to cancel. He chose to perform. He went on the air that evening and delivered the show as if nothing had happened. The audience never knew. He later said it was the hardest thing he ever did. The partnership with Abbott grew strained in their later years, and by the mid-50s, their popularity had waned. Lou Costello died of a heart attack on March 3, 1959, at the age of 52, just 3 days before his 53rd birthday. His partner, Bud Abbott, survived him by 15 years and is buried in a different state. They never reconciled their differences. From New Jersey, let us head south to the Baltimore area. At Druid Ridge Cemetery in Pikesville, Maryland, we find the grave of Divine, born Harris Glenn Milstead, the legendary performer who became a cult icon through a series of outrageous films directed by John Waters. Pink Flamingos, Female Trouble, Polyester, and Hairspray featured Divine playing characters of such gleeful excess and joyful bad taste that they helped define the camp sensibility for an entire generation. Divine was also a successful recording artist in the high NRG dance genre, scoring international club hits. Just as mainstream recognition seemed to be arriving, Hairspray was a genuine box office success. Divine died of heart failure in 1988 at the age of 42, just 3 weeks after the film's premiere. Moving south to Washington, D.C., we make our way to Fort Lincoln Cemetery, where we find the grave of Moms Mabley, one of the most groundbreaking comedians in American history, and one whose name is not as widely known today as it deserves to be. Born Loretta Mary Aiken in Brevard, North Carolina, around 1894, she endured a childhood marked by terrible hardship. She began performing on the Chitlin Circuit, the network of venues that were safe for black performers during the Jim Crow era, in the early 1920s. And she developed her act over decades of relentless touring. Her stage persona was a toothless, house dress-wearing grandmother in a floppy hat and oversized shoes who talked with startling frankness about men, sex, race, and politics. She chased young men, mocked old men, and offered observations about American life that were decades ahead of their time. "Ain't nothing an old man can do for me but bring me a message from a young one," she would say, and the audience would roar. For most of her career, Mabley was known primarily to black audiences. She was a headliner at the Apollo Theater in Harlem and a star on the Chitlin Circuit, but mainstream white America had little exposure to her. That began to change in the 1960s, when she appeared on network television shows and, in 1962, became one of the first female comedians to perform at Carnegie Hall. Her comedy albums sold enormously well. Her 1969 recording, The Youngest Teenager, reached the top 20 on the Billboard pop charts, a remarkable achievement for a 70-something black woman in an era when the record industry was dominated by young white rock acts. Moms Mabley died of heart failure in 1975 at the age of 81. Whoopi Goldberg, who directed a documentary about Mabley's life in 2013, has called her the most important female comedian most people have never heard of. Every woman who performs stand-up today walks a path that Moms Mabley helped clear. Let us now head to the Heartland. Our tour takes us to Peoria, Illinois, the city whose very name became synonymous with the American mainstream. Will it play in Peoria? Was the question vaudevillians asked about any new act, because if it worked in Peoria, it would work anywhere. At Springdale Cemetery, we find the grave of a man whose comedy played everywhere and whose influence remade the entire art form, Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor may have been the greatest stand-up comedian who ever lived. Among comedians, that is not a controversial statement. When working comics are asked who the best ever was, Pryor's name comes up more than any other. His comedy was raw, confessional, profane, and achingly honest. He talked about growing up in his grandmother's brothel right here in Peoria, a childhood so chaotic and painful that most people would have been destroyed by it. Instead, Pryor transformed it into material of extraordinary depth and vividity. He talked about race in America with a candor nobody had attempted before him. He talked about his own addictions, his failures as a husband and father, his encounters with the law, and he did it all with such precise, fully inhabited character work that audiences felt they were living his experiences alongside him, laughing not at him, but with him, and sometimes through tears. Early in his career, Pryor was a conventional comedian, clean, polished, modeled on Bill Cosby. He was successful at it, appearing on Ed Sullivan and in Las Vegas. But something about the act felt false to him, and in a now legendary moment at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas in 1967, he reportedly walked off stage in the middle of a performance, unable to continue pretending to be someone he was not. When he returned to comedy, he was a different performer entirely, raw, fearless, and revolutionary. His concert films, particularly Richard Pryor, Live in Concert from 1979 and Richard Pryor, Live on the Sunset Strip from 1982, are considered among the greatest comedy performances ever captured. He won 5 Grammy Awards for his comedy albums, won an Emmy Award for his writing, and in 1998 became the first recipient of the Kennedy Center's Mark Twain Prize for American Humor. His personal life was turbulent beyond measure. He was married 7 times to 5 different women. In June 1980, in the most infamous incident of his life, he set himself on fire while freebasing cocaine, suffering burns over more than half his body. He nearly died and spent weeks in the hospital. Characteristically, he later turned the experience into material for his act. In the mid-80s, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a disease that gradually robbed him of his mobility and eventually his ability to speak. For a man whose instrument was his voice, the cruelty was almost unbearable. Richard Pryor died of a heart attack on December 10, 2005, at the age of 65. His body was brought home to Peoria, to this cemetery, just a few miles from the streets where he grew up. Comedians from Eddie Murphy to Chris Rock to Dave Chappelle have all said the same thing. Without Richard Pryor, none of them would exist. From Peoria, let us head north and west to Madison, Wisconsin. At Resurrection Cemetery, we find the grave of Chris Farley. If John Belushi was the original Saturday Night Live wild man, Chris Farley was his devoted heir. And the parallels between their lives are so striking that they feel almost scripted by a playwright with a cruel sense of irony. Farley grew up in Madison, the son of an oil company executive, and was by all accounts an extraordinarily kind and generous person off-screen, the kind of guy who would give you the shirt off his back and then do a belly flop onto a coffee table to make you laugh. He found his calling at Second City in Chicago, just as Belushi had, and joined the cast of Saturday Night Live in 1990. His physical comedy was volcanic. He would throw his considerable body, nearly 300 pounds at his heaviest, into every sketch with total reckless abandon. Tables were smashed, chairs were demolished, and the studio audience was left gasping for air. His motivational speaker, Matt Foley, the one who lives in a van down by the river and warns young people about the consequences of bad decisions by destroying their furniture, became one of the most quoted SNL characters of the decade. The irony of the sketch, in which a man who has clearly ruined his own life lectures others about self-improvement, was not lost on Farley, who was struggling with the same demons he was parodying. He moved to film with Tommy Boy and Black Sheep, both co-starring his friend and frequent scene partner David Spade. Tommy Boy in particular became a comedy classic, propelled by Farley's combination of childlike enthusiasm and willingness to do absolutely anything for a laugh. Behind the scenes, though, he was in serious trouble. He went through multiple stints in rehabilitation for alcohol and drug abuse. Friends tried to help, and he would get sober for a while, but the cycle kept repeating. On December 18, 1997, Chris Farley was found dead in his Chicago apartment from an accidental overdose of cocaine and morphine. He was 33 years old, the exact same age John Belushi, his hero, had been when he died under strikingly similar circumstances 15 years earlier. Farley was brought home to Madison and laid to rest here at Resurrection Cemetery. From Madison, let us travel to the Chicago area, comedy's great incubator. At a cemetery in the suburb of Norwich, we find the grave of Gilda Radner, one of John Belushi's castmates, and, in the opinion of many who watched the show, the heart and soul of that original Saturday Night Live ensemble. Gilda was the warmest presence on a stage full of aggressive, competitive talents. While Belushi and Chevy Chase jockeyed for dominance, Gilda created characters that the audience genuinely loved. The hard-of-hearing editorialist Emily Litella, who would deliver passionate commentaries on misheard topics before being corrected with a sheepish "never mind." The loud-mouthed, hairnet-wearing Roseanne Roseannadanna, who told increasingly disgusting personal stories while offering commentary on the news, and the nerdy, nasal Lisa Loopner, who appeared in sketches with Bill Murray's equally nerdy Todd. She was goofy, brave, and utterly without pretension. She could make a crowd laugh simply by standing still and letting her face do the work. After leaving SNL, Gilda married Gene Wilder. They had met on the set of the film Hanky Panky in 1982, and seemed to be settling into a quieter, happier chapter of her life. Then, in 1986, she began experiencing persistent fatigue and abdominal pain. Her symptoms were initially dismissed by doctors as stress-related, a misdiagnosis that cost precious time. She was eventually diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She documented her fight against the disease with characteristic honesty and humor in a book called It's Always Something, a phrase borrowed from her Rosanna Dana character. But the cancer had been caught too late. Gilda Radner died on May 20, 1989, at the age of 42. The Saturday Night Live that aired the following week opened not with the usual sketch, but with a simple title card and a clip of Gilda performing. Her husband, Gene Wilder, whose grave we visited in Connecticut, spent the rest of his life advocating for better cancer screening and co-founded the Gilda's Club network of cancer support communities that continues to serve patients and families across the country. Let us continue east through the Midwest. In Glenview, Illinois, at Memorial Park Cemetery, we find the grave of Harvey Korman. For 12 years on The Carol Burnett Show, Korman was the ensemble's indispensable player, inhabiting dozens of characters each season and somehow managing to keep a straight face while Tim Conway, sitting beside him, did everything humanly possible to make him break. That struggle, Korman fighting valiantly not to laugh while Conway improvised increasingly absurd bits, became one of the show's most cherished pleasures. Korman also played the villainous Hedley Lamar in Mel Brooks's Blazing Saddles and voiced the Great Gazoo on the Flintstones. He died from complications of an abdominal aortic aneurysm in 2008 at the age of 81. From Chicago, we head east to Dayton, Ohio. At Woodland Cemetery and Arboretum, a beautiful park-like burial ground in the heart of the city, we find the grave of Jonathan Winters, one of the most brilliantly inventive improvisational comedians who ever drew breath. Winters was born in Dayton in 1925 and served in the Marine Corps during World War II before studying art on the GI Bill. He drifted into comedy almost by accident, entering a talent contest at a local radio station and discovering that he could make people laugh with nothing more than his voice and his imagination. And what an imagination it was. Hand Jonathan Winters a stick, and he would become 12 different people in 60 seconds. A fussy old woman, a drunken airline pilot, a bewildered farm animal, a pompous senator, a terrified golfer. Give him a hat, and he would conjure an entire world. He did not tell jokes in the conventional sense. He created characters and situations out of thin air, live in front of an audience with no script and no safety net. It was improv of a kind that left audiences and fellow comedians slack-jawed. Robin Williams, who was perhaps the only performer in history whose improvisational gifts rivaled Winters, called him his single greatest influence and spoke of him with something approaching reverence. The producers of Mork and Mindy wrote Winters into the show as Mork's son, a surreal and tender casting choice since Mork, being an alien, aged backward, and watching Williams and Winters riff together on camera was like watching two jazz masters trading solos. Winters was a regular on The Tonight Show for decades, where his appearances with Jack Paar and Johnny Carson became the stuff of legend. He won a Grammy for his comedy album, and later found a new audience voicing Papa Smurf in the Smurfs films. Behind the comedy, Winters dealt with bipolar disorder throughout his life. In 1959, he climbed the rigging of a sailing ship in San Francisco Bay, some accounts say while dressed in costume, and was taken to a psychiatric hospital. He spoke openly about his condition in later years, at a time when mental illness carried enormous stigma, and his willingness to discuss it helped pave the way for greater understanding. He also channeled his restless creative energy into painting, producing a large body of artwork that was exhibited in galleries. Jonathan Winters died of natural causes in 2013 at the age of 87, Robin Williams died the following year. Our journey now takes us back to the greater New York area. At the Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, a grand mausoleum complex in Westchester County, we find two comedy legends resting near each other. First, Joan Rivers. For half a century, Joan Rivers was one of the hardest-working and most fearless comedians in the country. She was also, for most of that time, the most famous female stand-up in America. She broke through in 1965 with a star-making appearance on The Tonight Show when Johnny Carson turned to the audience afterward and said, "God, you're funny." He made her his permanent guest host, a groundbreaking position for a woman in a field dominated almost entirely by men. Rivers built her act on a combination of self-deprecating humor about her appearance, razor-sharp observations about celebrity culture, and a willingness to say things that other comedians would not dare touch. No target was off-limits, including herself. "I knew I was an unwanted baby when I saw that my bath toys were a toaster and a radio," she once said. That kind of joke, dark, fast, personal, and delivered with a cackle that dared you not to laugh, was her signature. She later had a bitter falling out with Carson when she accepted her own competing late-night talk show on the fledgling Fox network in 1986. Carson felt betrayed and never spoke to her again, a wound that Rivers carried for the rest of her life. The Fox show was canceled after less than a year, and her husband and manager, Edgar Rosenberg, took his own life shortly afterward in 1987. It was the lowest point of her life. But Joan Rivers never stopped. She reinvented herself as a red carpet commentator, co-creating the pre-show celebrity fashion commentary that became a fixture of award season. She starred in reality television, she sold jewelry on QVC, and through it all, she kept performing stand-up, playing clubs and theaters well into her 80s with the same ferocious energy she had brought to the stage as a young woman. She died in September 2014 at the age of 81, from complications during what should have been a routine endoscopy at an outpatient clinic in Manhattan. She was performing a sold-out show at a comedy club just days before the procedure. Also here at Ferncliff rests Sid Caesar, a towering figure of television's earliest golden age. If you want to understand what television comedy looked like before anyone had figured out the rules, you need to understand Sid Caesar. Your Show of Shows, which aired live on NBC from 1950 to 1954, was a weekly 90-minute comedy program that is still cited by many historians as the greatest variety show ever produced. It went out live every Saturday night with new material, sketches, parodies, musical numbers, written and rehearsed during the week and performed before a studio audience with no safety net. Caesar was the star and driving force. A big, powerfully built man who had studied saxophone at Juilliard, he possessed a physical and vocal range that seemed almost unlimited. He could play any character, a pompous German professor, a bumbling Japanese general, a harried husband, a suave continental lover, and he had an uncanny ability to speak in fake foreign languages that sounded absolutely authentic to anyone who did not actually speak those languages. His ensemble included Imogen Coca as his primary foil, along with Carl Reiner and Howard Morris. But the real secret weapon was the writer's room. At various points, the writing staff included Mel Brooks, Neil Simon, Larry Gelbart, and Woody Allen, perhaps the most extraordinary concentration of comedic brilliance ever assembled in a single office. Brooks later said the writer's room was like a war zone, with everyone screaming ideas at once, and that Caesar would sit in the middle of the chaos and choose the best material with unerring instinct. After Your Show of Shows ended, Caesar continued with Caesar's Hour and other programs, but the intensity of his work schedule took a terrible toll. He became addicted to alcohol and barbiturates, and for a time in the 60s and 70s, he was largely absent from the public eye. He eventually got sober and made a gradual comeback, appearing in films like Grease and the Mel Brooks comedy History of the World, Part 1. Sid Caesar died of natural causes in 2014 at the age of 91. Carl Reiner, his old friend and colleague, lived to be 98. Leaving Ferncliff, let us drive a short distance to Hawthorne, New York, and the Gate of Heaven Cemetery. Here rests Jimmy Durante, the Schnozola. so called for the famously oversized nose that became his trademark. Durante was a fixture in American entertainment from the 20s through the 60s. He started as a ragtime pianist in New York saloons, became a nightclub comedian, moved to Broadway, and conquered radio, film, and television. His gravel-voiced singing, his fractured English, and his endearing sign-off, "Good night, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are," made him one of the most beloved performers of his generation. The identity of Mrs. Calabash was a mystery for decades. It is now generally understood to refer to his first wife, Jean, and a fond memory the couple shared in the town of Calabash, North Carolina. Jimmy Durante died of pneumonia in 1980 at the age of 86. While we are at Gate of Heaven, let us walk a bit further to find Fred Allen, one of the all-time greats of radio comedy. In the 30s and 40s, The Fred Allen Show was one of the most popular and critically admired programs on the air. Allen's humor was cerebral, witty, and satirical. He turned his acid wit on advertisers, bureaucrats, and the radio industry itself with a precision that delighted intellectuals and critics. His long-running mock feud with Jack Benny, whom we visited at Hillside Memorial, was one of the great running gags in broadcast history. And the two men were actually the closest of friends in private. Allen struggled with the transition to television and suffered from chronic heart trouble. He died of a heart attack while walking near his Manhattan apartment in 1956 at the age of 61. Jack Benny was a pallbearer at his funeral. From New York, let us make a quick trip out to Forest Hills, Queens to Mount Hebron Cemetery. Here lies Moe Howard, the de facto leader of the Three Stooges. If there is a more divisive question in comedy than, are the Three Stooges funny? It has yet to be found. For generations, they have been the hill on which friendships and marriages are tested. Those who love them, and there are millions, consider the Stooges the purest distillation of slapstick comedy ever created. Those who don't understand the appeal tend to wonder what is wrong with everyone else. Moe was the bull-haired, sharp-voiced boss of the group, the one who spent most of his time slapping Larry, poking Curly in the eyes, and bonking heads with hammers, wrenches, crowbars, and whatever else was at hand. The Three Stooges produced nearly 200 short films for Columbia Pictures between 1934 and 1959, cranking them out at a pace that would exhaust a factory line. The shorts were cheap to make and wildly profitable, and Columbia kept the Stooges under contract for a quarter of a century. The pay was modest. Moe once said they were the highest paid actors per laugh and the lowest paid per film. But the work was steady. The genius of the act was its relentless balletic physicality. Every slap, every poke, every tumble was carefully choreographed and rehearsed. People got hurt. Moe once accidentally broke Larry Fine's nose during a scene, but the illusion of spontaneous violence was what sold it. After the short film era ended, the Stooges found a massive new audience when their old Columbia shorts were sold to television in the late 50s. A whole new generation of kids discovered them, and Moe, Larry, and Curly Joe DeRita toured and made feature films well into the 1960s. Moe was the last survivor of the original trio and spent his final years working on an autobiography and making personal appearances. He died of lung cancer in 1975 at the age of 77. Their beloved original third member, Curly Howard, the one with the shaved head, the high-pitched voice, the floor spins, and the nyuk nyuk nyuk, is buried clear across the country at Home of Peace Cemetery in East Los Angeles. Curly was the most popular Stooge, a genuinely inspired physical comedian whose improvisations, the barking, the whooping, the lying on the floor spinning in circles, added a layer of unpredictable joy to the act. Sadly, his health deteriorated rapidly in the mid-40s. He suffered a series of debilitating strokes beginning in 1946, when he was only 43 and was forced to retire. He spent his final years in nursing care and died in 1952 at the age of 48. For years, his grave went unmarked because the family could not afford a proper headstone. Fans eventually raised the money for a memorial. Larry Fine, the wild-haired middle stooge who absorbed punishment from all sides, is interred at Forest Lawn, Glendale, where we began our tour today. While we are on Long Island, let us visit the new Mount Carmel Cemetery in West Babylon, where we find Alan King. The cigar-chomping, dinner-jacket-wearing stand-up comedian spent 5 decades making audiences roar with curmudgeonly observations about suburban life, airlines, insurance companies, and the indignities of getting older. King was a headliner in Las Vegas during the golden era of the Strip, and a perennial guest on every major talk show from Ed Sullivan to David Letterman. He also had a successful parallel career as a dramatic actor and film producer. Alan King died of lung cancer in 2004 at the age of 76. Heading back into New Jersey, we stop at Beth Israel Cemetery in Woodbridge. Here rests Jackie Mason, one of the last great voices of the Borscht Belt tradition. Born Yaakov Moshe Maza in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, to a long line of rabbis, Mason was actually ordained as a rabbi himself before leaving the pulpit for the stage. His act was a whirlwind of accented outrage, arms flying, voice rising, skewering everything from politics to relationships with a blend of old-world Yiddish humor and razor-sharp modern observation. He won a special Tony Award for his one-man Broadway show, The World According to Me, in 1988. Jackie Mason died in 2021 at the age of 93. Let us fly south now to Tulsa, Oklahoma. At Memorial Park Cemetery, we find the grave of Sam Kinison, the former Pentecostal preacher who became one of the most explosive stand-up comedians of the 1980s. Kinison did not merely deliver punchlines, he shrieked them, building to volcanic eruptions of rage and frustration that left audiences gasping. His material about marriage, relationships, and world hunger was savage, frequently controversial, and undeniably, unforgettably funny. Rodney Dangerfield, whom we visited earlier in Westwood, gave Kinison his big break by putting him on an HBO Young Comedian special in 1985. From there, his career rocketed upward. On April 10, 1992, Kinison was killed in a head-on collision with a pickup truck on a desert highway between Las Vegas and Needles, California. A teenager driving in the wrong lane had crossed into his path. Sam Kinison was 38 years old. From Oklahoma, let us travel down to Texas. At the Sparkman Hillcrest Memorial Park in Dallas, we find the grave of Bill Hicks, one of the most influential stand-up comedians of his generation, and, at 32, one of the youngest people on our tour. Hicks started performing stand-up at the age of 13 in Houston, sneaking out of his parents' house to perform at the Comedy Workshop. By his 20s, he was developing material that was unlike anything else in American comedy. Hicks was a philosopher in a comedian's clothing, or maybe a comedian in a philosopher's clothing. His act tackled politics, religion, consumerism, the media, and the nature of human existence itself, all delivered with the intensity of a revival preacher and the intellectual rigor of a college lecturer. He railed against advertising, against the Gulf War, against what he saw as the willful ignorance of the American public. He talked about drugs and spirituality with equal passion. He dared audiences to think rather than merely laugh, and many of them did both. In the United States, Hicks struggled to break through to the mainstream. His material was too confrontational, too political, too willing to offend for the talk show circuit. His most famous brush with American television came in October 1993, when he taped a set for The Late Show with David Letterman, and the entire segment was cut from the broadcast because CBS standards found the material unacceptable. It was the only time in the show's history that an entire performance was censored. The incident became legendary in comedy circles. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Hicks was a genuine star. British audiences embraced him with the fervor they usually reserved for their own. He sold out London's West End and was compared to Lenny Bruce by the British press. In the summer of 1993, just weeks after the Letterman incident, Hicks was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He continued performing for as long as he could, doing his final show in January 1994. He died on February 26, 1994, in Little Rock, Arkansas, and his family brought him home to be buried here in Texas. He was 32 years old. In the decades since his death, his reputation has only grown. In 2004, Comedy Central ranked him among the top 10 stand-up comedians of all time. Comedians from Bill Burr to Doug Stanhope cite him as a primary influence. Letterman eventually aired the censored set in 2009, 16 years after it was recorded, and apologized to Hicks's mother on the air. Let us head back west now to Los Angeles, where we have a few more stops to make. At the Mount Sinai Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills, we find two comedy legends in close proximity. First, Garry Shandling. His two television programs, It's Garry Shandling's Show and The Larry Sanders Show, rank among the most influential comedies of the late 20th century. The Larry Sanders Show, in particular, which ran on HBO from 1992 to 1998, is widely regarded as the direct ancestor of every single-camera, no-laugh-track comedy that followed it, from The Office to Curb Your Enthusiasm to 30 Rock. Shandling played a neurotic, insecure late-night talk show host, and the program's blend of showbiz satire and uncomfortable human honesty was revolutionary. Off-screen, Shandling was deeply interested in Buddhism and meditation, and he mentored younger comedians, including Judd Apatow. He died suddenly from a pulmonary embolism in 2016 at the age of 66. Near Shandling at Mount Sinai rests Buddy Hackett, who for decades was one of the most popular nightclub comedians in America. A roly-poly, rubber-faced performer, Hackett could clean up his act for a family audience on Ed Sullivan's stage, and then turn around and deliver devastatingly raunchy material in a Las Vegas showroom. He voiced Scuttle the Seagull in Disney's The Little Mermaid, and made memorable appearances in The Music Man and It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, that epic 1963 comedy that featured practically every working comedian in Hollywood. Buddy Hackett died in his sleep in 2003 at the age of 78. Our next Los Angeles stop takes us to the Pierce Brothers Valley Oaks Memorial Park in Westlake Village. Here rests Norm Crosby, known affectionately as the Master of Malaprop. Crosby built his entire act on mangling the English language in increasingly hilarious ways, speaking with absolute confidence while using entirely the wrong words, creating a cascading absurdity that never failed to delight an audience. He headlined in Las Vegas for decades and was a regular presence on The Tonight Show. Norm Crosby died from heart failure in 2020 at the age of 93. Let us return once more to that remarkable little cemetery in Westwood, Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park, for one final visit. We already paid our respects to Rodney Dangerfield, Don Knotts, Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau, and Carroll O'Connor. But there is one more comedian here we must acknowledge. Peter Falk rests in the same tiny graveyard. Now, Falk is principally remembered as a dramatic actor, but anyone who watched Columbo knows that the shambling, seemingly absent-minded detective was one of the great comic creations of television. The rumpled raincoat, the glass eye, the way he would turn to leave a room and then wheel back around with just one more thing. All of it was comedy of the highest and most subtle order. Falk won 4 Emmy Awards for the role. He died of pneumonia in 2011 at the age of 83. In this 2-acre cemetery, he is yet another neighbor to Rodney Dangerfield. One imagines Rodney would have something to say about the crowding. Our tour now takes us to Orange County, south of Los Angeles, and the Pacific View Memorial Park in Corona del Mar. Here rests Bob Newhart, one of the most quietly revolutionary comedians in American history. Newhart's 1960 debut album, The Button-Down Mind of Bob Newhart, was one of the most extraordinary recordings in the history of comedy. It was the first comedy album ever to reach #1 on the Billboard charts, and at the Grammy Awards it did not merely win Best Comedy Album, it won Album of the Year, besting Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, and Harry Belafonte. For a comedy record to beat the biggest names in music was almost unheard of, and it signaled that something new was happening in American humor. Newhart's style was the key. Where other comedians worked loud, he worked quiet. He was a soft-spoken, slightly stammering, thoroughly reasonable accountant type trying to make sense of an unreasonable world, usually heard on one end of a telephone conversation where the audience could only guess at the other side. His routine imagining a modern public relations man advising Abraham Lincoln. "You changed your mind about the beard, Abe? That's good. We polled on that and it came up very positive. Was a masterpiece of deadpan. He channeled that persona into two enormously successful sitcoms. The Bob Newhart Show, which ran from 1972 to 1978, cast him as a Chicago psychologist surrounded by neurotic patients and eccentric neighbors. Newhart, which ran from 1982 to 1990, cast him as a Vermont innkeeper. The finale of the second series, in which Bob wakes up in bed next to Suzanne Plachette, his wife from the first show, and reveals that the entire 8-year run of Newhart had been a dream, is regularly cited as the greatest sitcom finale ever broadcast. The studio audience that night erupted so loudly that Plachette had to wait nearly a minute before she could deliver her first line. Newhart continued performing stand-up well into his 90s, and late in life he had a memorable recurring role on The Big Bang Theory that finally won him a competitive Emmy Award after decades of nominations. Bob Newhart died in July 2024 at the age of 94. Our final West Coast stop carries us to a place with no headstone and no cemetery: the waters of San Francisco Bay. Robin Williams was cremated after his death, and his ashes were scattered in the bay he loved. We cannot visit a grave, but we can pause and remember, because no tour of comedy's resting places would be complete without him. Robin Williams was, by almost any measure, the most electrifyingly talented comedian of his generation. His improvisational abilities operated on a plane that no other performer could reach. He shifted between characters, accents, and ideas at machine gun velocity, finding connections no one else could see, generating laughter so intense that audiences could barely draw breath. He was equally gifted as a dramatic actor, winning the Academy Award for Good Will Hunting. Behind the manic energy, Williams struggled privately with depression for much of his life. In August 2014, at the age of 63, he took his own life at his home in Tiburon, California. It was later revealed that he had been suffering from Lewy body dementia, a progressive and incurable brain disease that causes hallucinations, confusion, and despair. The comedy world lost not only a performer that day, but a gravitational center, someone around whom the entire art form seemed to orbit. From the New York area, let us fly south to Nashville, Tennessee. We are not here for the country music singers, that would be another tour entirely, but for one particular performer at Spring Hill Cemetery in the suburb of Madison. Here rests Minnie Pearl, the first lady of country comedy and one of the most beloved entertainers the Grand Ole Opry ever produced. For more than 50 years, Minnie Pearl greeted audiences at the Opry with her signature entrance. "Howdy, I'm just so proud to be here." Wearing the straw hat with the price tag still dangling from the brim that became one of the most recognized props in all of American entertainment. The character was a sweet, gossipy, man-chasing country girl from the fictional town of Grinders Switch, a place so small and remote that it became a running joke in itself. Minnie would share breathless stories about her family, brother, Uncle Nabob, and the ever-elusive boyfriend she could never quite land, with an enthusiasm and warmth that made audiences feel like they were sitting on a porch back home. Behind the character was Sarah Ophelia Colley Cannon, a college-educated, cultured woman who had studied theater at the Ward Belmont School in Nashville. She created the Minnie Pearl persona in the late 1930s after encountering real country characters during her work with a touring dramatic company, and she refined it into one of the most durable acts in the history of live entertainment. She was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1975, and for decades she was as much a part of the Opry as the building itself. A stroke in 1991 ended her performing career, and she spent her final years out of the public eye. She died in 1996 at the age of 83. That price tag on her hat, which became as famous as the hat itself, always read $1.98, a joke about vanity and thrift that never got old. Our tour has covered a tremendous amount of ground, from the sprawling memorial parks of Southern California to the quiet cemeteries of New England, from the grand mausoleums of New York to the modest burial grounds of the Midwest and South. We have visited vaudeville pioneers and television revolutionaries, slapstick masters and philosophical provocateurs, gentle souls and screaming firebrands. 60 men and women scattered across the American landscape, all united by a single ancient and irreplaceable gift, the ability to make other people laugh. And so our journey comes to its final stop. We are not going to a cemetery this time. We are going to San Francisco Bay. Robin Williams was cremated after his death, and his ashes were scattered in the waters of the bay he loved. We cannot visit a headstone or lay a flower on a grave, but we can pause here at the water's edge and remember, because no tour of comedy's resting places would be complete without acknowledging the man who may have been the most astonishing performer any of us ever saw. Robin Williams arrived in the American consciousness as Mork from Ork, the alien on the sitcom Mork and Mindy, and from the very first episode it was clear that something extraordinary was happening. His improvisational abilities operated on a plane that no other performer could reach. He shifted between characters, voices, accents, and ideas at a velocity that left audiences breathless, finding connections nobody else could see, generating laughter so intense that people could barely keep up. He went on to become one of the biggest movie stars in the world. Good Morning, Vietnam, Dead Poets Society, Mrs. Doubtfire, Aladdin, and he proved his dramatic range beyond any doubt by winning the Academy Award for Good Will Hunting. Behind all that manic energy, Williams struggled privately with depression and addiction for much of his life. On August 11, 2014, at the age of 63, he took his own life at his home in Tiburon, California. It was later revealed that he had been suffering from Lewy body dementia, a progressive and incurable brain disease that can cause hallucinations, confusion, and profound despair. His wife, Susan, later wrote that the disease had been terrorizing him in his final months, though he did not yet have a diagnosis. The comedy world lost not only a performer that day, but something closer to a force of nature, someone around whom the entire art form seemed to orbit. His ashes are in these waters now, part of the fog and the tide and the light off the Golden Gate. That is our tour, friends. 60 comedians, from the vaudeville stages of the 1910s to the comedy clubs of the 2000s, from the biggest names in the business to a few you may not have thought about in years. They made us laugh. They made us think. A few of them broke our hearts, and all of them left the world a little funnier than they found it. Thanks for coming along. Good night.